Ladies and gentlemen, good evening.
Good evening.
I noticed students when I got on the stage, you all got really quiet, so old habits die hard. That's a good thing. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Jeff Kappen. I teach international business here at Drake University. And this semester, I'm assistant director of the Principal Center for Global Citizenship, which is sponsoring this event. It is my pleasure to welcome the panel, both from Principal and Drake, to discuss with us tonight implications of globalization, technological innovation, and populist politics. And the plan for the evening, after I introduce the panelists, each of them is going to talk for about 10 minutes on topics related to the theme of the evening. I have a couple questions that I've crafted to get the discussion going, and then we will open the floor to the audience for questions. So, by way of introduction, first, Mr. Jim McCaughan joining us from Principal Global Investors, where he is the CEO and is also president of Global Asset Management. Mr. John Merante, economist and macro strategist for Principal Portfolio Strategies. And last, Professor David Skidmore, professor of political science here at Drake University. We're going to let Professor Skidmore kick it off because he's the one with the PowerPoint. And then we'll all join the stage and listen to the next two presenters. Then I said questions will follow. So, Professor Skidmore.
Thank you. It's funny because up until a few years ago, I never even used PowerPoint, and now I can't do anything without it. So tonight's topic is inspired by the rise of populist politicians and parties and movements in the United States and Western Europe that have really thrown mainstream parties and politicians into kind of a panic, actually. And so we want to explore a little bit about why there's rising political support for populist nationalist politics. And is there a danger that the liberal international order that we've had since World War II could implode under the pressures of rising trade protectionism, anti-immigration policies, the dismantlement of institutions like the European Union or the WTO? Are these possible, and what are the pressures that are leading to this kind of politics? And so I'm going to focus mostly on the United States context. And then John Merante is going to talk a little bit about the British and maybe some European context. And then Jim McCaughan is going to bring in a kind of a little bit of different perspective, focusing on the role that technology plays in political and economic change. So I'm going to walk really quickly through some factors that I think help to account for the rise, in particular, of Donald Trump and his electoral victory, but more broadly, the rise of populism and nationalism in the American context. And the first factor, I think, is the loss of manufacturing jobs over the past couple decades, especially since about 2000. This is due in part due to automation, technological change, as Jim will discuss, but it's also partly due to the rise of global manufacturing competition in other countries. You can see here the decline starting around 2000 in the number of manufacturing jobs, a slight recovery in the last few years from the 2008 trough, but still nowhere near where we once were. And of course, these were the kind of jobs that you could, without a college education, you could get a job in a factory, you could spend a career there, make good money, and have a middle-class life. That is an increasingly difficult proposition. This shows a little bit the auto industry, which of course was a core industry in the U.S. economy after World War II. We can see here that the bottom, the blue area at the bottom is U.S. automobile manufacturing production. You can see basically it's stable. We're not producing fewer cars than we used to, but you can see also that the growth of the overall automobile production globally has been tremendous, but it's all been overseas, especially in recent years in China. And so the U.S. market share on a global basis has declined, even though production itself is fairly stable. So manufacturing jobs, that's one factor. Second is wage stagnation. This shows us that there was a close relationship between labor productivity increases and wage increases up until the 1970s. And then toward the end of that decade, you begin to get a divergence where wages stagnate even as productivity continues to increase. That relationship was the heart of the social compact after World War II, the bargain, in a sense, between capital and labor, that workers would welcome and participate in bringing about productivity increases, and they would be rewarded commensurately. And that relationship has started to break down in the early 80s. You can see this is a different measure. The top line shows basically a flat line in terms of real purchasing power of worker wages. A third factor is rising inequality. This is a chart that shows the percentage of the American gross national product accounted for by the top 10% of income earners. You can see that there was a rising inequality. The top 10% accounted for a growing share of income up until about 1928 when there was a peak. It dropped a bit during the Great Depression, but it was really World War II that played an equalizing function that really brought down the gap between rich and poor. And there were several decades following World War II when the U.S. enjoyed a level of relative equity that we haven't seen before or since. And starting around, again, 1980 or so, we began to see the gap between rich and poor rising, and now it's at levels that we saw earlier in the past century. This is another way of looking at similar kind of phenomenon. The red line is the income increase of the top 1%, then the top 20%, and so on. So those at the top have gotten the lion's share of the benefits in recent decades. One of the factors that is also important is that education has become more and more of a factor in determining economic success. So you can see here that those with advanced degrees have experienced income growth. Those with college degrees, somewhat less, but still growing. And those who have less than a high school education, their incomes have really fallen a great deal. And male incomes, having started at a higher place, by the way, and there's still a income gap favoring males over females, but nevertheless, male income has, especially at the lowest education levels, has fallen. Another factor is the decline in unions. The unions serve to bargain on behalf of workers collectively. They also serve a political role in advocating for workers. And the unionization rate, which peaked at about 35% in the 1950s, has now fallen. This shows 13%. I think that includes public sector unions. If we looked at private sector, I think it's around 7%. It's almost negligible except in a few very specific industries. And this is not only important in terms of the ability to bargain for wages and benefits, but also politically. So workers now who feel they're struggling, they're atomized from one another. There's not the collective institutions that can guide them and politically. And so they're vulnerable, I think, to certain kinds of appeals that are sometimes chauvinistic. And then social distress from all of this. This is a rather shocking piece of data that looks at the death rates of middle-aged people, 45 to 54 years old. And you can see that the normal pattern is that over time, death rates fall as health improves and as people's standard of living rises. And in most countries, you can see that's true. It's also true that the thick blue line in the middle is for U.S. Hispanics. But look at the top red line. That line represents American white middle-aged people. And you can see there that not only is actually death rates are rising, which is happening nowhere else among the countries on this chart, but it's also much higher than any of the other countries at this point in time. So this is obesity, alcoholism, opioid use, suicide, a lot of measures of distress. If there's one graph that you take away in your mind tonight, it would be this one, I think. This, I think, is a good summary of the overall picture and why we're seeing a rise of nationalist and populist sentiment in Western countries. This shows, from left to right, you're looking at the world's population distributed according to their on a 100-point scale according to their level of wealth relative to one another. And so at the far left are the very poorest, at the far right are the very wealthiest, and then in the middle are the middle income levels. And what we see there is that those at the very bottom have not experienced income growth in, or at least between '88 and 2008. There was almost no income growth at the very lowest levels. At the very highest levels, you had what's called a booming global elite. Incomes increased quite substantially for those at the highest levels. For those in the middle of the scale, you see, those represent workers in places like China and Brazil and Turkey and Indonesia and Southeast Asia. And you can see there that those folks experience rapid income growth. Besides the very poorest, the other group that whose income stagnated, saw almost no growth, were those around the 80th percentile. Those who are wealthier or have higher incomes than most of the world's people, but they're not increasing. They're actually falling behind those above them, and their advantage over those below is disappearing. And so we often see this with populism, that it's a lower middle class within wealthy countries. It's kind of the lower middle class who feels threatened by the wealthy and by the poor below them. This shows some distinctive, how this translates politically is into a set of very nationalist and almost chauvinistic political positions. And you can see here, this is looking at Republican voters during the primaries, and you can see that on the right side are Trump supporters, and on the further left are non-Trump supporters. You see the big gap. Trump supporters are not sort of traditional Republicans in many ways. They're much more nationalistic and populistic in their attitudes. They're just very distinctive from either traditional Democrats or traditional Republicans. This looks at some general election exit polling. You can see here that Trump supporters are those who feel their financial situation is worse today than it was before. They're folks who think that trade takes away jobs, and they're folks who support deporting undocumented immigrants. One researcher looked at counties and tried to see what were the major factors that would allow you to predict a higher Trump vote. And they found the factors were counties would vote for Trump disproportionately if education levels were low, the percentage of adults employed was low, the loss of manufacturing jobs was high, and the death rates for middle-aged whites was high. This shows us the shift over the last 4 elections. So if we look at the one at the top, that's folks who have a high school education or less, no college. And what you see there is that they tend to vote Republican. They're on the pink side, that's the Republican side. In 2004, between 2004 and 2008, they moved a little bit toward the Democratic side. Then they moved a little bit back in 2012. But look what happens in 2016. There's this dramatic shift toward become much more Republican. They were already on the Republican side of things, but they became much, this was among the different educational groups and also income groups, this was the most radical shift in one direction or another. So these were working class people responding to Trump's populism. And then finally, if you look at the 10 states where manufacturing job losses were greatest, 8 of them went for Trump. In the 5 upper Midwest states that Trump won that had been Democratic, you can see 3 of them had voted Democratic in 5 straight elections, another in 4 out of the last 5, and Ohio in 3 of the last 5. These were considered this heavily Democratic states. They all went for Trump in 2016. They were all, and that was due in large part to those lesser educated working class folks who had lost factory jobs and were now shifting in favor of Trump. So I think it's, there's a strong political economy argument to be made to explain the rise of these populist and nationalist sentiments. And that's it.
Thank you very much. Let's see the stage. So, thank you, Professor Skidmore. I think we will stick with the theme of the disillusioned voters. And I'm going to ask John Merante to speak next, taking us from the U.S. context to the British one. Some of the same factors, perhaps, and some difference. The floor is yours.
Thank you. And clearly there is a relationship between the Trump voter and the Brexit voter. If you look at the Brexit voter, part of it could be ascribed to geography. Part of it could be ascribed to wealth levels. But really, what characterized the Brexit voter more than anything else were that they were part of one of 2 groups. The first group were social conservatives who felt alienated from current social mores, and they were seeing their country, what they believed was the loss of their country. On the other hand, there were those who've been disaffected by globalization, technology, deindustrialization. These are those former middle-class, hardworking employees in manufacturing industries that saw those jobs disappear. What united them was the issue of immigration. And what you found was that that is what the pro-Brexit campaigners focused on, made a central issue, and that resulted in a situation where the only answer could be to leave the EU because of the open borders, because of the requirements of the free flow of people within the EU, left you in a situation where you could not get control of your borders if you remained a member of the European Union. Now, part of the problem that they're going to face going forward is that the vote for Brexit is going to most likely leave the UK poorer than it otherwise would be. And what the workers and social conservatives who voted for this were looking for an improvement. They wanted something better. But you're now going to be left with a country that doesn't have as much resources to provide the types of improvement in education, in vocational training, in economic development that could address the very real problems that these voters are experiencing, the very real reasons why they're so disaffected and alienated. But you're going to wind up in a situation now where their problems are very likely going to be compounded, which, in my view, could lead you to a much more dangerous situation where this association only accelerates and more people turn away from those established parties, and you wind up with continued growth of movement towards populism.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. You know, John made before I get on to technology, which is my main topic, John made some very interesting points about the attitudes of Brexit voters, and from what David said, you can see some parallels to the Trump voters, even if they're a bit different. But to me, one of the most interesting comments I've seen recently came in a study about attitudes to business from Edelman, the PR agency, who actually are retained by Principal. They have a study annually of attitudes to business, which they publish at the World Economic Forum in January. And going through the presentation of it a few days ago, the question that struck me was, they'd asked a question to these various people that divided it between opinion formers and the mass market. And the question was something like, would you still vote against free trade if doing so made economic growth slower? And the answer to that was a shocker to me. It was well over 70% said yes. In other words, Philip Hammond, the UK Chancellor of the Exchequer, was wrong when he said the British people did not vote to be poorer. If you take that answer from Edelman's survey, yes, they did. They voted to be more protected, more insular, and actually in the end recognizing they'd be poorer because they were saying they'd take it even with lower economic growth. Now maybe they wouldn't put it that way, but I genuinely do think that many of the Trump voters whose attitudes were analysed by David actually voted against immigration and free trade, recognising that it would make them poorer. And I think there's a paradox here because, you know, as the great campaigner and pretty decent president Bill Clinton said, it's the economy, stupid. You know, that isn't how people voted in either Brexit or the general election here last year. So anyway, that's probably enough of amateur political science from me. The technology is the thing that really interests me here. And I do believe that not only business people, politicians, policymakers are currently underestimating the impact of technology on the economy. And I think that's kind of easy to say, but let's talk about some aspects to perhaps support that. If you think about advances in technology, it looks to be all positive. You get better products, new ideas get distributed, you get services that didn't exist before from, whether it's retail, whether it's online retailing, or if you went back 50 years, satellite television, you get all sorts of things out of technology that make life better and tend to lower costs as well. The price in real terms of doing most things has come down quite a long way as economic activity and technology have improved. The problem is, and this has always been true, that advances in technology eliminate jobs. An example of that, a very obvious one, which was one of the formative events of this country, railroads. The incoming of railroads, the advance of railroads, led to many people who previously tended horses for long-distance transport becoming unemployed. Now, looking back, nobody really cares because the economic growth from the railroads employed all those people within relatively few years and a lot more in much more congenial circumstances and with much higher incomes. So, that displacement's always been handled, and I've heard it suggested that there has never been a technological innovation that in the end, given long enough, resulted in loss of jobs. But unfortunately, the intensity of technological change right now makes that not the case. Sometimes those who are against the mechanization of jobs that leads to less jobs are referred to as Luddites after the English textile workers in the early 19th century who went around smashing automatic looms because it was displacing their hand looms. That's highly understandable, but in the end, they all got jobs and things settled down. I do think that social unrest is something we're kind of seeing in the way the electoral processes are working around the world. But lest you doubt my comment about accelerating social change, the last 10 years have seen social media, the sharing economy, the widespread deployment of robots, the development of artificial intelligence and machine learning, and by the way, Wi-Fi. You get really quite upset if your Wi-Fi doesn't work. Well, 10 years ago, you didn't even know what it was. And, I think that's indicative of the amount of change there has been. When I put this thesis to better economists than me, I get one of two reactions. The reaction I respect more is, that's why I look more at the nominal than at real, referring to GDP. I think that's one rational way of responding to this technological change. The answer I respect less is, you're exaggerating, there have always been measurement effects, they're no worse than usual. I actually think these measurement effects on productivity, GDP, and so on are actually a whole lot more intense now than they were 10 years ago, just because of all the pace of change I described then. So the political response to this disruption, I would argue, has been the rise of populism, and both David and John talked about that. In the US, the Trump phenomenon, obviously Brexit, but think of other countries. Japan and China both have leaders that in some ways our President Trump can relate clearly to. Shinzo Abe is a Japan first guy, he's a nationalist, that's his background, and really, in many ways, looks after Japan's narrow interest. President Xi, similarly, he's a China first guy. So that has been in place for quite a long time for various reasons in those countries. Unless David's chart of that, growing assets, growing incomes in the middle of the wealth distribution make you think there's no trouble in China, it is more complicated than that, and Chinese workers feel their jobs are being stolen by Bangladesh. So, this is not something where anyone feels like a really big winner. You have also, of course, we'll all be watching next month the French presidential election. Everyone from Paris thinks that Le Pen can't win. But I was talking to a good friend who lives in London now and was from Paris, a senior executive in the asset management industry. He was giving me all the usual arguments why Le Pen can't win. We then started talking about his country house in Alsace, and he said, of course, 95% of the locals support the National Front. That's the Trump-Clinton divide. Paris will be, in American terms, blue, but a lot of the rest of the country will be red. So look out. I give it 50-50 at the moment as to whether Le Pen wins or not. That's probably higher odds than most people are suggesting. By the way, Le Pen winning would not be the end of the European Union, because she won't control the French Parliament, who would have to vote for an exit, for example, from the currency. It would lead to a lot of dissension, but probably she wouldn't get her way on a Frexit. You got Italy. Obviously the constitutional referendum last year failed and Prime Minister Renzi resigned, but you still have the only pro-EU political party in Italy in power. Come the next election, there's a problem. And it isn't clear who will win the next election, but it looks likely that a majority of the votes will go for anti-EU parties. That's a very big deal because Italy is very central to the European project. Germany is a bit different. AfD have been talked about a lot. Rather like Geert Wilders in the Netherlands, the AfD will probably not get many votes. They won't get much power in Germany because the Germans are relatively prosperous and feel pretty good about how they've dealt with mechanization, which is actually one of the clues, because education is the way they've done it. When you get to remedies, education is so important. There's a pretty widespread cry to bring back manufacturing jobs, and you saw that in both sides of our general election in the US last year. That is basically futile because manufacturing is now so automated. David's chart showed that car production in this country has been basically flat in numbers. The cars, by the way, now are a whole lot better than they used to be. but that employment has come crashing down. That's just because of automation, and the manufacturing jobs are not coming back for that reason. Technology, therefore, is essentially deflationary. It brings down prices, it brings down costs. The demographics right now are very deflationary. Older population wants experiences, not stuff. So, you know, the demand for manufactured is not going to be great, but the demand aggregate in the economy can be quite healthy. So you've got a deflationary trend going on, which I think tends to mask a lot of the economic numbers. I certainly do believe that GDP is probably, if you really knew what the real GDP was, it's probably a bit faster than the recorded numbers show you, simply because of these measurement effects. I feel that pretty strongly as I observe the economy and the micro side of it. Just one last thing before I pause and throw it back to Jeffrey to ask questions. A lot of talk about the current account deficit, as if a trade deficit was somehow a defeat. A trade deficit for America is almost inevitable. There's not a lot you can do about it because we have a capital account surplus. And the reason that is, and probably will remain the case, to some extent is actually a good reason. American holdings abroad tend to be equities, high return. Foreigners' holdings in America tend to be fixed income, low return. That difference of return allows us to finance exports with imports without long-term stress. I think it'll be very hard to eliminate these trade deficits we have. I think it almost as a matter of arithmetic is close to impossible. And if it does, if you really promote exports, you end up with a currency rocketing up. So I think that the political debate has got a lot of problems in the economics, mostly related to technology. I should stop there and let Jeffrey take control.
Thank you very much, Jim. Okay, so I have some questions that are a little bit pre-posed to the panelists. I'm going to start with politics and then move to economics and then back to politics. I'm going to start with John first on the Brexit implications. We have an assertion that you made, that Jim supported, that Britain may end up poorer rather than richer. A lot of this seems to depend on the outcome of the Chapter 50 negotiations and what's going to happen. Jim already talked about the French elections, and I've read some observers who say, well, what's going to happen in Britain will depend a little bit on what the French and Germans decide. When it was announced last year, we had the Premier of Luxembourg saying Britain will get nothing. We have Prime Minister May saying we're going to get a better deal than Norway. Where do you see it going?
Not well.
Get your crystal ball out.
Yeah, I see it going not well. There are a lot of problems, and picking up on what Jim started out very early on about the voters voting to be poor. One of the casualties that we've seen over recent years is most people don't believe people like Jim and me any longer. We can lay out the economics and say why we think this is going to happen, but no one has faith in the experts any longer. This was complicated in the Brexit debate because, let's say, some pro-Brexiters engaged in exaggerating the potential negatives of what would happen during if the EU were to leave. And while over a longer period, they may wind up being right still, they were saying the minute you vote for Brexit, everything collapses. And Brexit came, Brexit went, nothing collapsed, stock markets went up. The only place you saw weakness was in the pound. And that actually leads to better exports. So for a lot of people, that was a good thing. But now we're getting into what Britain's relation with Europe is going to look like going forward. And that is going to be very difficult because if you think that one of the major motivations for Brexit was to reduce immigration, to get back control of the borders, as one of the slogans went, to keep Britain British. it is very hard to see how Theresa May and the Tory party can walk away from that. They are going to be forced to be committed to ending free migration into the UK from the EU. Only problem with that, the free flow of people is one of what's referred to in the EU as the four essential freedoms. Free flow of people, free flow of goods, of services, and capital. And the Commission, and pretty much all the governments have been very clear, you're not going to get to cherry pick them. If you want any of them, you have to take all of them. So I find it very difficult to see how they negotiate around that. I don't think it's they're going to be mean to the Brits. I don't think it's they don't want to cooperate. But once you start taking apart the strands and pulling on one, it's going to unravel, and the EU knows that. If you get that sort of deal for Britain, then the Swedes are going to want that now. The Dutch are going to want it. The Germans and Austrians are definitely going to want it. And suddenly, the common market doesn't work anymore.
And by the way, the deal that Norway and Switzerland have, both of them outside of the EU, involves freedom of movement that would be unacceptable to many of the Brexit voters.
Yeah, thank you, yeah. I mean, there's no model out there.
No.
Even though the UK would be too big to follow those models, even if it couldn't accept what the responsibilities that Norway and Switzerland have accepted. So once that goes, that means you are not going to have what's referred to as passporting rights for the banks, which is very important to London. As a matter of fact, you have already seen delays in expansion in London, and you've seen planning made to move, to set up alternative centers within the EU, whether it's Paris or Liechtenstein or Dublin, so that they will be able to continue to service their clients in the EU. So the only Brexit that I think that's plausible is a hard Brexit. And the problem with this, and we'll get into it a bit more also, is that if you're talking about hard Brexit, that means you're starting from scratch. You negotiate the terms of separating, and once you do that, which will take quite some time, it's only then that you begin to negotiate the terms of the economic and trade agreements that you're going to have. If you take the EU-Canadian Treaty on Economic and Trade Association, you find that it took, in order to scope it, decide what you're going to cover, negotiate it, and ratify it, it took roughly 10 years. Trade, I mean, to paraphrase something that was said earlier about something, I forgot exactly what it was, but trade agreements are complicated. I used to work in the State Department, and I was on the side of some WTO agreements. Those negotiations would go on for a decade. And then you get into ratification. So it's a very, very long process. And in the meantime, Britain can only fall back on the agreements within the WTO. The problem for Britain doesn't cover financial services, and even though it eliminated most tariffs across industrial countries, it kept in place certain areas, like automobiles and parts, which is a major export for the UK. So we can go through the models that will show that currencies will adjust and it will offset tariffs and all of that good stuff. The problem is that doesn't happen immediately. There will be a period, and potentially a fairly long period, of disruption across these agreements and arrangements. So I don't see a quick, happy resolution to Brexit.
You don't think it's all going to be done in 2 years?
No, 2 years is just the starting
That's a
point.
fantasy.
So if we take it from interstate relations to intrastate relations, they announced the Brexit. Scotland is already talking about another independence referendum. There's a lot of concern in Ireland about the open border and the common travel area. If the Republic is in the EU and Northern Ireland is not. There was a headline a week ago that a record number, the most ever, of British citizens are pursuing Irish and French citizenship through spouses and families for fear that they might get locked out. As we're putting on your risk analysis hat, will the UK survive? Will Britain be British in its full extent 5 years from now, 10 years from now?
As rough as it's going to be, it'll probably be rough. And you have to realize my boss's name is McCaughan. And so I'm treading on dangerous ground talking about Scotland. But actually, I know what you think, and I actually agree with a good chunk of it. The basic problem for Scotland is that their main asset, the greatest asset, not the main, but the greatest asset economically, is North Sea oil. North Sea oil is a diminishing asset. It is also an asset that's trading at much less than it sold for a few years ago. And as a mature oil field, it's getting to the point where you're going to see an increase in decommissioning of wells. All of this combines to greatly reduce the tax revenue that the Scottish government can count on. In addition to that, Scotland is not a successor state to the UK. It cannot just accede based on treaties already negotiated. They would, if they become independent, they would have to negotiate as a separate independent country, albeit a much smaller economy, but still a separate independent country. So you're looking at, maybe it wouldn't take as long as it would take with Canada and the UK, simply because it's a smaller economy. But you're also looking at a situation where you don't, even the EU will not have as many bureaucrats as they would need to potentially conduct several major trade negotiations simultaneously. So from my perspective, Scotland outside of the UK is probably in a weaker position, even post-Brexit.
I'd like to just comment on the referendums. There's a strange asymmetry here. Brexit won by somewhere between 2 and 3%. It was pretty close. And in fact, Scotland and London were the two places that voted overwhelmingly for Remain. And that's part of the reason why there's the talk about reopening the Scottish referendum. I would point out, however, Scotland voted to stay in the UK by over 10%. It was not even close. And that was at a time when the oil price was much higher and the budget of Scotland looked a lot stronger. So I think it's by no means a foregone conclusion that Scotland would vote for independence, even if it meant the ability to perhaps reapply for the European Union. I'd agree with John. I'd actually go further. I think the Spaniards might veto Scotland joining the EU because they wouldn't want to encourage the Basque separatists. There's a lot of different currents here which are going to be quite unpredictable.
Or the Catalans, either.
Yep.
Gotcha.
That's right.
Well, I do have a couple things I could address that have come up, but if you.
Well, no, I was just going to touch briefly on Northern Ireland, but please go ahead.
Well, if Jeff had another question.
Go for it.
So there are a couple things that were mentioned earlier I wanted to touch on. Jim talked about disruptive technological change and automation, and we can see that a lot of the internet, media. We talked about the idea of self-driving cars at some point. We can see how bricks and mortar retail is now facing competition from Amazon, and these have the potential to create very rapid productivity increases and to shed labor very quickly. But I think actually, if you look at the economy, you find that workers, are in different categories, facing different situations. In some industries, workers, jobs losses are related to automation. In others, it's not actually automation or productivity. It's the fact that, for instance, the multi-fiber agreement in textiles is done away with, and all of a sudden, in South Carolina, textile workers are facing competition from Bangladesh, workers who are able to work far less. So actually, they're less productive than those South Carolina workers, but they're cheap enough that it makes up for it. So it's actually a de-productivity move. And then there are others who are sheltered from that kind of competition, but let's say I can go to Great Clips and get a $12 haircut. Well, I could go 20 years ago and get a $12 haircut too. And their wages haven't increased, their real earnings are going down, unless they learn to cut hair faster. And there's a lot of industries like that. In Iowa, our minimum wage is $7.25, and believe it or not, people still work for that. And in real terms, minimum wages have declined dramatically. So there's some industries actually are absorbing workers in part because there's no incentive to increase productivity because wages are so cheap. And given the workers who are being displaced from the areas where there are productivity increases, they have no choice but to accept half the wage levels that they did in a steel factory or an auto plant. So I think actually it's a segmented markets and workers with different kinds of skills and even in different locations face very different kind of problems that we have to be alert to. The other factor is that we've seen an increase in the relative return to capital compared to labor. And what's interesting here, Thomas Piketty's written about this, and he says that there's a kind of stickiness to profits, that profits tend to not decline except during wars and other kind of extreme events. And so, but economic growth does vary even more. So let's say you have an economy that grows at 3% a year, as the U.S. economy did for many decades. And let's say that the capital's share of that is 1% out of the 3. So 1/3 of the increased production goes to capital, and 2/3 of the increased income goes to workers, right? Now let's say that growth rate's cut in half. Now it's 1.5% per year. What happens if capital's share capital continues to get 1% increase a year, and now that leaves only 0.5% for workers? Now then the workers are in relative terms have lost. So actually, a slowing economy, which is what we've seen, will tend to lead to greater inequality, which I think is not fully understood in many discussions. One other thing I wanted to mention was that Jim talked about security, and I think actually that is a big part of the populist appeal, and I think it radically distinguishes it from the traditional Republican Ronald Reagan appeal. Like the Republican message is risk. It's let the market work. It's competition. You don't protect people. You force them to compete in the market, and that will bring out innovation, and it'll bring out hard work, it'll provide all these incentives, right? But it rests upon the prod of insecurity. What the Steve Bannon and the populists are saying is, you face insecurity from your jobs are threatened by Mexican immigrants. Your factories are threatened by Chinese, by China. Your lives are threatened by Middle East terrorists. We're going to provide security in all of those areas. We're going to build a wall. We're going to punish the companies that outsource. We're going to build a big military to protect you from terrorists. And notice that Trump, during the election campaign at least, also said, and we're not going to cut your Social Security. We're not going to cut your
Medicare. So we're going to provide you with security, right? And that's why the tensions are so fascinating within the Republican Party, because this latest health care bill, that did not fit well with the Trump message to his base. That was a traditional Republican health care bill. And so these tensions are going to play themselves out. And but that issue of security for people who have been through the financial crisis, who've lost their homes, who've lost social mobility, have lost jobs, that is a big political point of residence for them.
Since you took us in the direction of economics, and Jim mentioned Davos earlier, EY at Davos this year said that it was the responsibility of business, universities or educational institutions, and governments to figure out what to do about the displaced and those who are not winning under globalization. And I would open the floor to the three of you to pitch solutions to the problems you've identified. What might we do, even locally here in Des Moines, between the university and partners like Principal to ameliorate the situation?
Yeah, I thought David's chart of income for different levels of education kind of said it. Very good commercial for education, by the way. I think that the effects of education in terms of making people able to be economically active are really kind of unchallenged. So I think if business is to find an appropriate role in curing these problems, it has to be around the encouragement, whether the funding, the training programs for our own workers, allowing people to get ahead through education. I don't think there's really much more that business can do. I think the other thing that politicians will think about looking forward, and this is very un-American, but it's being aired in some surprising countries, and that is a national income. Basically, a level of income, kind of like a retirement pension that everybody gets, recognizing that maybe some of them will not be employable. The Swiss, some Swiss cantons had a vote on this a few months ago. It didn't get through, but it got a lot of debate. I said it was un-American. It's actually pretty close to what Alaska does with the Alaska Permanent Fund. You get quite a nice check, a few $1,000s every year, just if you're an American living in Alaska. Don't recommend it for other reasons, but that's one reason why. That's one reason that people quite like it there. But that is almost like the sort of national income that's being talked about in a number of countries. Those are probably the only two responses I can think of that are really constructive. There may be others.
I would just mention that, so different countries have, in terms of the inequality part of it, have different approaches. In Japan, the gaps between wages are not that high. So CEOs and workers, the gap is much less than in the U.S. On the other hand, in Scandinavia, Sweden, for instance, they let the market, determine wage levels and compensation, and the before-tax inequality is actually quite high. It's after-tax. They have such a progressive tax system that after-tax, then the inequalities are smoothed out, and that, of course, is a possibility any country could adopt, but it requires a certain kind of political culture, I think, that the United States really doesn't have.
Sure. A couple things. One on basic income. A lot depends on what you think about technology. If you think that technology is going to continue to advance, to continue to drive costs down, and I agree with that as far as that goes, but then you also think that, well, we might not be quite to the singularity, we're close enough to artificial intelligence that you're going to get many people who simply won't have an opportunity for a job, then the only solution is a basic income. And that isn't necessarily such a bad solution, because if automation goes that far, what you're talking about is a very, very productive economy. But then you have to accept higher taxes on capital, which also ties into how do you make taxes more progressive. To the extent that we're taxing ordinary income or labor at much higher rates than we can tax capital, that contributes to that inequality. And I would note in Piketty's writing, he recognizes that post-war period where in the jargon where R, the return on capital, wasn't higher than growth. He thinks that's an anomaly. It may be an anomaly, or it may simply be you had stronger unions, you had much more progressive taxation, you had politicians responding to concerns about individuals because you did have types of representation. So I think Piketty did great work. I'm not convinced that his findings are inevitable. I find historical inevitability really not all that inevitable at all. But there are approaches, but whether it be seen as un-American, I don't know. But what you're looking at is a situation where you're going to have to refocus the educational system. You're going to have to refocus taxes, and you have to get back to greater competition. Because one of the reasons why you have such a concentration of wealth is because you've had a collapse in competition. Most markets are controlled by a handful of companies. Look at airlines. Let's talk about United. Could they have gotten away with that if 4 airlines didn't cover 80% of flights? And if the airlines didn't own access to individual airports? I mean, we have seen a great deal, you had a great deal of deregulation, but that resulted in a great deal of concentration, in industrial concentration.
I think that's really a great point, because that was crucial to the New Deal, to the Democratic Party's, progressive tradition for much of the 20th century, which was antitrust, right? To weigh in, the state would weigh in on behalf of more competition. And so if you ask, what is it about the Democratic Party, at least since Bill Clinton, that has, in a sense, undercut their working class support? It's the fact that they are no longer against concentration. And the perfect example of this was how we dealt with the financial system in the financial crisis. We managed to find a solution that further concentrated the banking sector rather than bringing greater competition.
Yes.
Yeah, perhaps unconventionally for the type of job I have, I'm actually reasonably in sympathy with the idea of bringing back Glass-Steagall, because that would get rid of some of that concentration that David talked about. I don't think it's a bad idea, even if it was embraced by both Senator Sanders and now President Trump.
All right, I have one final question for the panel, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. We hear about voters voting to be poor against their interests. You stated they no longer listen to or respect opinions of experts. We see all these conflicting phenomena in which people might be voting against their self-interest, depending how we define it. As we look forward to 2018 and 2020, well, how do we reach the Trump voters if we are so inclined? How do you engage with populism if we think it may be destructive or unproductive in the short or long term?
Well, I think one of the things that makes it tough is in the United States, and is the problem of race, and the way in which if the pie's not growing, and people who are previously have been relatively privileged are losing status, then people get pit against one another very easily, and they tend to adopt kind of a tribal attitude, and use shortcuts to identify, people who they think are different, and race is one of those. And so it's so easy. We keep talking about white working class. They're not the only part. Whites are not only the only workers. They're workers of all shades, right? And they get forgotten about. But it's very difficult to build a working class politics in a country where there are such deep racial divisions, complicated in recent decades by high levels of immigration.
Yeah, I mean, on that subject, Make America Great Again is a very white slogan. If you're black or Hispanic, it's never been greater. And I think that's a very interesting thing to think about, and the divisive nature of these campaigns all around has been quite distressing. Now, I think one of the reasons I think it's very hard to do anything about it is fragmentation of the media. When 10 years ago, if you had really crazy bigoted views, the people around you would tell you, lay off it, it's not a sensible idea. If you now have crazy, stupid views, you can find a whole community that thinks the same way on the internet. I don't know how that's going to get challenged. I think that fragmentation of news sources is leading to a whole lot of bad information and lack of transparency. Maybe that's the clue. Maybe transparency ultimately, and the internet will tend to act that way over time, may be the cure. But if so, it won't be by 2020. I find it very hard with the fragmentation of the media to know how the populism vanishes, other than over quite a long time.
Yeah, I think it's very difficult. I find it troubling, actually. One of the big criticisms of the Democratic Party, by Democrats themselves in many cases, is that they became too entrenched in identity politics. And the next words out of their mouth is, and we now have to find a way to appeal to white working class. Are you talking about identity politics just of a different sort?
Yeah.
And it's not addressing the broader issues that, in fairness to Bernie Sanders, whatever you think about him, he was trying to address, which is how do we reach out to all workers, whatever shape they are. This is also complicated, very much so, by what Jim just pointed out about the fragmentation of the media. I watch Fox News, you watch MSNBC, somebody else reads Breitbart, which scares everything out of me.
Yeah.
But,
I recommend flipping between The Guardian and Breitbart. That'll give you a balanced view.
you don't mean the Daily Mail and Breitbart.
No, that would reinforce Breitbart.
So you're dealing with this type of environment, and what I'm finding of great concern is how something like fake news, which was used to define an actual Orwellian use of language and information, has itself become an Orwellian term. Because now fake news is anything I don't agree with.
Yeah.
I'm not sure how we address this, because I can find lots of people who agree with what I have to say, no matter how ill-informed and unthought out it is. And so I get that type of reinforcement, and we all are subject to confirmation bias. So I'm actually fairly pessimistic about all of this. But I probably read too much Orwell in my youth.
Were those the solutions you were looking for?
Yes, I'm feeling much better about 2018 and 2020.
Well, yeah, I mean, 2018 is going to depend on how the short-term economics and politics play out.
Yeah.
I suspect if the American Health Care Act had gone through, the Republicans would have been in for a very bad midterm. I think actually Obamacare could save them at the midterms, but let's see.
Yeah, I mean, as long as they don't allow it to collapse,
Yeah.
work actively to collapse it by holding back on subsidies. Yeah, but basically, anytime you have to come up with a plan that is going to wind up with 24 million people being thrown out of health insurance. And we can quibble about what the CBO got right and wrong. But let's call, anywhere between 12 and 24 million people, it's a lot of people. That's not going to play well in the elections. And so it really is in their interest to try to keep it going for a while. I think some of them are smart enough to realize that they kind of have to do that, but right now they're, let's put it this way, they're acting like the Democratic Party I grew up with. Or as Will Rogers said of the Democrats, I'm not a member of any organized party, I'm a Democrat. If you're looking for 2018, we have a whole bunch of special elections coming up. There's one today in Kansas. There's another one in Georgia next week, and there's one coming up in Montana. And by all accounts, and I don't know when we'll get the results in tonight, Kansas, the Republicans in an area that Trump won by over 20 percentage points felt the need to have Mike Pence record a robocall, send in money, have Ted Cruz show up to campaign, and then today have another set of robocalls by President Trump. This is very, very strange.
Okay, we've got some time remaining. I'd like to open it, and I have my first question.
Is campaign finance reform a way to look forward?
There are a lot of institutional reforms that would be helpful. Reforming, gerrymandering and campaign finance reform and, but if, Donald Trump actually didn't he didn't benefit from Citizens United. He didn't actually have a lot of outside money coming in. He didn't even spend a lot of money, frankly. Now he did benefit in that Citizens United allowed that Republican field to remain a bunch of kind of marginal candidates to remain in the race longer than they would have otherwise, because they had sugar daddies. And that meant the field could remain fragmented, and he never faced, just one or two main contenders who might early on have been able to, take him out. As long as he had a big field, he did better. But yeah, there are reforms like that. But in that one's going to be difficult. If the Supreme Court says that it's constitutional, then you have to change the Supreme Court and reverse the decision or do a constitutional amendment. The first of those seemed like something that was feasible until recently. Now it doesn't look that way. But yeah, I think Americans would do well. There's a lot of ways in which our democracy it doesn't work very well. It's an old, antique 18th century constitution. And there are better ways to run democracy. And we would do well to consider them, but it's not an easy system to change.
It could be worse, David. You could have the British system, which in a way is an elected dictatorship.
Yes, sir.
So how is demographics going to play into this over time? You can't go for 20 minutes without somebody mentioning millennials, and all of this seems very anti to the millennial ethos. I think of Brexit and how the demographics, the younger went very much for Remain, the older went very much for Brexit. Does this correct itself over time, or?
Yeah, by the time the millennials get to the age that people actually go out to vote. I mean, I'm not picking on millennials at all. I think that's one of the most ridiculous things out there. Because whatever we're saying about millennials, our parents said, if not about us, about our friends. So, there's nothing new with this. these damn kids. Well, but it's just a fact, and historically, it's been the case that young people vote less than older people.
Yep.
So unless they suddenly get inspired to start voting while they're still young, we have to wait for that generation to get into the voting age, I guess. But ideally, and maybe we're beginning to see it with Indivisible, the Democratic group that just spread up, that you're seeing younger people getting involved, staying involved, and hopefully, because I want everybody, regardless of age, to show up at the polls, hopefully they will show up at the polls. But if you're counting on that demographic, then you have to count them coming out to vote.
Beginning to vote. On the Brexit vote, it was so bifurcated by age that a year on, it's quite likely that enough Brexit voters have passed away that if you rerun it and everybody voted the same way as they did last June, the population would vote for Remain. I really think that's almost, it's got to be almost the case. I have actually discussed this with a few journalists, but none of them were ghoulish enough to go and get it researched.
I think that if you look at issues, if you look at race, if you look at environment and climate change, if you look at sexual preference, the young generation is so far ahead in having progressive, forward-looking attitudes on many of these things that is very helpful. But here's what I worry about. I think I worry that a lot of the young people have lost faith in our institutions and trust in the institutions. And so, for instance, there was a lot of youth enthusiasm for Bernie Sanders, and then I saw a lot of youthful hopes dashed when he didn't get the nomination. And I knew a lot of young people who said, I'm not voting for Hillary Clinton. I'm not going to do the pragmatic political thing. I'm going to vote for Jill Stein or Gary Johnson, or I'm not going to vote at all. And so if there's a lack of faith in the sort of the mainstream institutions, then it's very difficult, because we do operate on a two-party system. And so I think that's a question mark, is whether the young people will invest in strengthening institutions as opposed to kind of abandoning them in disgust.
What else would you like to know?
I just was going to push back a little bit against the populist label for Donald Trump. I don't really accept that label for Trump or the Republican Party. I teach part-time at a community college, and I've been trying to do a lot of research on a lot of these far-right parties. I'll be real quick, but 194 countries went to Paris and signed this agreement. Only one country came back out of those 194 with a major political party that either denies climate change or shrugs its shoulders at it. And as my study has been of Marine Le Pen, the Wilders in the Netherlands, the Alternative Party in Germany, etc., what I see is every one of those far-right parties deserves the populist label, because they are telling the common people that there is an elite running the country that is corrupt or the system is rigged, but they're also doing something to remedy the situation. At my little bit of research, Sweden, all those far-right parties, they're strengthening healthcare, a lot of them. They're strengthening public sector workers, etc. You look at the Republican Party, the Ryan-Trump budget, it's not only a complete assault on working people and poor people, but it's even assault on the laboratories, the brain, the science of the nation. I'm not even sure how to even define it anymore ideologically. As I was doing this research, I kept coming across Angela Merkel being labeled the leader of the free world. And I'd say this to my students, and they'd say that's because of November 8th. But I would say, no, it's actually not. It's because the United Nations is looking at, 11 Republican-run states here for going after the First Amendment. I think much of the world is seeing the United States as an oligarchy, something slipping more towards sort of the Putin-Erdogan model, far away from those, I can see that. So I guess I'm just kind of pushing back a little bit. I'm trying to find out, think, as a U.S. citizen, sort of where we are at. I mean, maybe that they'd be more like the Know-Nothing Party from the 19th century, they would call the Know-Nothing Party, but I guess I just don't see them as populist because the part where they try to remedy the situation is lost to me, unless I'm losing something from their budgets or I'm missing something that the governors are doing in these states. I could be, but...
That's a really interesting line of argument. I would, however, point out that Madame Le Pen is definitely Putin's favoured candidate in France. He's made that explicitly clear. He's hugged her much more obviously than he did President Trump. So, you know, there's some parallels. But I think the core of what you're saying is that the Republican Party is not populist, but President Trump is not really a Republican.
That's right.
President Trump is a populist who, in an opportunistic sense, the Republican Party has hitched up behind because it got them a good political reception. And when I was in North Carolina just before the election doing an investment presentation, and I heard very strongly from the people that were there, and this was principal agents and customers, heard very strongly from them the one single reason they were going to vote for Trump was abortion in the Supreme Court. A single issue in their mind. The economics they didn't care about, that was the one thing they wanted out of it. So I think what you have with Trump is a populist who has taken over a non-populist party. On healthcare, what President Trump has said, pretty repeatedly actually, is, I will not take away your insurance, we will bring back better insurance and inclusive coverage. Indeed, it's only 5 years ago since pre-candidate Trump, when asked about healthcare, said, I have successful businesses in Scotland. Scotland has a single-payer system. I think it would work here. Now, that won't fly in his current party, but it was what he said as recently as 5 years ago. He's a natural populist. He is all for entitlements. And that's why he's so at odds with the Freedom Caucus. You know, those are his arch enemies in Congress, not the Democrats. You know, it's really the 30 or so in the House who are particularly on the right economically and against entitlements. Those are the people he's antagonistic to in Congress more than anything. That's the sort of schism in the Republican Party that David was talking about earlier. So if I look at Trump, I think he is a populist from the thing he says. I completely agree with you, the Republican Party isn't.
But his budget isn't populist. It's an all-out assault on Meals on Wheels and all these.
Well, this is one of the things
True.
is that Trump is, he doesn't have the discipline to be a real populist, right? I mean, that would actually require knowing something about policy and actually carrying through on the politics.
Tell us your politics, David.
But he just kind of, well, no, I mean, he's just deferring to Ryan or others because he doesn't know what he's doing and he's out of his depth. But I think that, it's interesting to look at his own political economy, the political economy of Trump. Trump has been a critic of globalization and all this. Well, actually, he's a real estate investor. His stake is in the non-tradable sector of the economy. And we talk about some of his investments overseas, but in terms of his overall portfolio, that's a fairly small part. So he's mostly domestic. And he's also a debtor, right? He lives off of debt. He doesn't, he borrows money for these investments. And so he's actually not on the side of the creditors, right? In his own thinking, the way he thinks about things, he's on the side of the debtors. That's why he even said, for the U.S. national debt, well, why should we pay all that off? We could just, make a deal, people, they can get 60 cents on the dollar for their U.S. bonds, treasuries, we could probably, just strike a deal. That's how he thinks about things. So if you think about his own political economy, you could better understand, I think, where he's at with respect to some of the, constituencies that are more at the heart of the traditional Republican Party. He's at odds.
Yeah, that's true.
I was going to say a few things. One, I would agree with you that every time Trump is referred to as a populist, Barbara Florett is turning over his grave. And while it's true he's in the non-tradable sector, for the last 20 years at least, since the New York City banks refused to lend him any money, he's been very much reliant on foreign money.
Right. Yes,
So he does have that tie to the rest of the world. I think Jim is very correct in pointing out the difference between Trump as populist and Republicans as not being populist. But I think you also need to take account of something David said earlier, and that's race. And the benefits I get, I deserve. It's those people who don't deserve the benefits. It's those undeserving poor who don't deserve the benefits. And that is part and parcel of what Republicans have been running on, to a large extent, since Nixon's Southern strategy.
Yeah. On the budget, by the way, I think the key element in the budget from Trump's point of view was the build-up in military spending. I don't think the rest of it he really thought much about. I mean, maybe that's David's point about blindness on policy. But I don't think he really meant taking away all those entitlements. I don't think his voters would feel very good about it. So I think that budget is kind of, like the budget always is in this country, it's a political document. And in Trump's mind, I think it was all about the military.
Yeah, I would think that it's sort of like the ACHA. He didn't read it, he didn't understand it. That was something McCaughan put together.
Who knew healthcare could be so complex?
And by the way, I just want to say that as a radical professor, I always love it when I'm on a panel where the bankers outflank me on the left.
I think I'll take that as a compliment, David. I'm not sure how you meant it.
We have time for about one more question, so, sir, if you please.
Back to Brexit, there was a little discussion about companies starting to move businesses, operations to other countries in the event Brexit comes to a hard close and they can't export as easily. Are you seeing the talent leaving as well? Are the educated people in London, the financial center people, moving to other countries, other companies, and other locations? And will that have a significant impact on the UK even before negotiations are underway?
The answer to that is not yet, John. I mean, we have, as you know, a pretty substantial business in Europe, and by far the largest number of people, more than 80% of them, are in London. We're not yet taking people away from London, but we do have operations in Dublin, Amsterdam, and Munich. We're also in Zurich, which is not in the EU, but has a clearer relationship to the EU than perhaps Britain might have. So we have choices. We have people in different locations. I would say preliminarily, our current thinking is we're much more likely to add in the EU ex-Britain than we are in Britain. So it's going to be a marginal impact, I believe. I think we're fairly typical of financial institutions in thinking about it that way.
Yeah, from what I've seen, what you're beginning to see are people who aren't from Britain volunteering to go back to the home office, whether that home office is in New York, or it's in Milan, or it's in Paris. And so there's some trickling out.
But not the highly paid French. The French taxes mean that they don't know what to do if they're in London. If you trade a 40% marginal rate in Britain with a 75% marginal rate in France, it's pretty easy for our French people in London to sit tight.
By the way, before we wrap up, I just wanted to say that, we've been, I think this may be the 9th.
Something like that.
Every semester we have one of these panels with, in cooperation with Principal Financial Group, and
we focus on some theme in the global economy, and it's always a rousing good time. I mean, we just have a lot of fun up here, just kind of pontificating, and so if you enjoyed tonight, come back next fall when we have the next one, and next spring when we have another one, and bring people with you, because it's I think it's a pretty high level discussion, and it's also kind of, the format allows for informality and a little bit of humor here and there. So I hope you enjoyed tonight and come back and try us again.
Thank you, David, for that sort of concluding comment. It would appear from the discussion we have a lot of work to do ahead of us in many areas of politics and technology and the economy. Would you please join me in thanking our panelists for the